Welcome to Hope Students Online. We are so glad you are joining us. If this is your first time, we would love to get a chance to meet you. So if you don't mind, go ahead and DM us and we have a gift just to say thank you for joining us. Or if you have any questions about Hope Students or Jesus, we would love to help you take your next step in your faith journey. So go ahead and DM us. We would love to be able to help you take that next step. Also, if you don't mind, take a moment to like, comment, and share this post so that we can provide hope for every home. We are so excited that we are starting a brand new series called One Small Step. And we are so excited to start this brand new series called One Small Step. And our hope and our prayer during this season through the series of conversations is to help us go from where we are to what God is calling us to. And where God is calling us to close the gap between where we are and what God is calling us to. Because I believe that God is calling us to a lot more than sometimes our lives show in the way in which we live. And sometimes we miss out what God is calling to us because we're a little afraid to take that one small step. That step of obedience to what God is calling us to next. And we're going to look in Hebrews chapter 11 at a couple stories of people who were obedient to what God had called them to. And we see what God did in their lives because of their one small step of obedience. Because sometimes the things that God calls us to is hard and we don't have all the answers. But what I've learned in life is, man, it's worth it. Although I don't have the whole blueprint and I don't have the whole plan, taking that one step of obedience is worth it. To see what God has in store and what He's calling me to. Have you ever been asked to do something that you didn't really feel like doing or want to do? Right? Have you ever been asked to take out the trash after a long day of school, or to do the dishes, or to pick up your room, and really in your heart in that moment it's like, I don't really want to do these things. I don't want anything to do with these. I don't feel like I should be doing this. I don't want to. And your mom and dad or grandparents or whomever it may be in your life is asking you to take that step of obedience and listen. And as I was reading through and preparing for this talk about Noah, I ran across this story of somebody when he was talking about his mom and obedience. And she gave a definition that I think is so good for us to think about. He says, my mom had a definition for obedience that was contingent upon me doing what she asked without objection and a happy heart. If I did what was asked of me, but grumbled, complained, or objected to doing it, I was in massive trouble. So his mom said, obedience is doing what I'm asking you without objection and a happy heart. Because how many of us, right, we can all raise our hand that have done something that we didn't want to do, but we did it because we were afraid to get in trouble, and we didn't have a happy heart about it. We weren't excited or ecstatic to do those things. And so often that can work its way into our relationship with God. And so often we do it with grumbling and complaining and not understanding ultimately that God is calling us to something bigger. So we do this often with our parents, our teachers, and God. And I can assure you that God is more interested and cares more about your heart than your actions. So how do we obey God with the right heart? We're looking at the story in this case of obedience from Noah. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, it gives us some information about Noah. Because Noah, if you look at his story, you could be amazed by his faith and his obedience. But we also realize that God is calling us to so much more in our lives. And so how can we learn and not just be amazed by his obedience? I believe we can learn how to take one small step in following God by learning through the story of Noah. And so this is what is said in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. It says, by faith, Noah being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. God calls Noah to build this ark, and he gives him explicit instructions that we're going to read in Genesis chapter 6 of what the ark should look like. But I love that it says being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. Like they hadn't happened yet. Like that Noah didn't know what this was going to look like, but out of a reverent fear constructed, like he just did what God called him to. And too often, and I know I'm guilty of this as well, that we let our fear stop us from being obedient. Fear stops our obedience to what God is calling us to. But what if we could learn from Noah that it doesn't matter what the world says, because we're going to read about that. It doesn't matter what people say, but it matters what God thinks. And it matters where our heart is. So in Genesis chapter 6, starting in verse 11, Noah is given this strange assignment. It says this, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on earth. Verse 13, and God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. And so he gives them explicit directions on how, hey, Noah, this is what happened. The world is fallen, it's twisted, it is consumed with self. And so you know what? I'm gonna do something that has never happened before, but I'm asking you to build this ark. Verse 15. This is how you're to make it: in the length of 300 cubits, in its breadth 50 cubits, and its heights 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. These are some explicit instructions. Verse 17, so for behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wives, and your sons' wives with you. And every little living thing of all flesh you shall bring to every sort into the ark, and keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of them, every sort, shall come into you to keep alive. Which I can't imagine, right? Because you got some pretty cool animals that are going to be coming a part of this ark. But you got some scary ones too, full of snakes and spiders and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, right? Like there's so many other things, and it's like, hey, you're going to keep them alive, and you're going to take care of them, and the earth is going to be flooded, and they're going to live on this ark. Verse 20, and take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all of that God had commanded him. All right, Noah has every reason in this moment to be skeptical. Right? I think I naturally would be too. One, because I think some of those animals I wouldn't want to be a part of my boat. But I also think that it never rained on earth before. And God calls him and challenges him and convicts him to build something that is unprecedented, that had never been heard of, to protect him from something that's never happened before. And people mocked and ridiculed him while he built the ark. Some historians believe, and scholars believe, it took Noah between 50 and 75 years to finish the construction of the ark. It took time, and it took steps of obedience over and over and over again. Could you imagine living your entire life being dedicated to obeying God and the world mocking you? Noah never objected. He never stopped and he never wavered. In fact, verse 22 says Noah did this. He did it all that God commanded him. Noah never wavered from what God was calling him to. He constantly took step after step after step of obedience. In our own lives, are we willing to do that? Sometimes it takes a wrestling match and a long period of time before we really surrender to God. But what if we did what Noah did and obeyed without objection? When God called us to something, and he calls us to reach our friend and our neighbor, and he calls us to take a stand for our faith, and he calls us to serve, and he calls us to be difference makers, we obey without objection. No turning back, no questioning. We just step in and fill what God is calling us to do. Imagine what would happen in our lives and in our world. Imagine what would happen in our student ministry. Imagine what would happen in your families if you obeyed God without objection. Imagine what would happen in our church if we obeyed God without objection. If we lived this faith of one small step of obedience day in and day out, what it would do for the world and for the gospel. So how do we apply this to our lives today? James says this in James chapter 4, verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. See, God has called us to so many things, and we know that he's calling us to do it. But when we know what's right and we don't do it, it's sin. Or when we know God is calling us to go love our neighbor and we mock our neighbor. If God is calling us to be difference makers and we just live a mundane, non-committal life and we just go through the motions, it's sin. See, this delayed obedience is disobedience. Being delayed to what God is calling you to do isn't just, I missed a mark or, I procrastinated. No, it is disobedience. One small step we can take towards obeying God without objection is not to wait. Noah, as soon as God commanded him to do it, he stepped in and began acting. He wasn't delayed. He didn't let us procrastinate. And sometimes I don't think that we intentionally disobey God, but we procrastinate to what God is calling us to. We ignore the voice of the Spirit to step out by faith in the instructions that he gives us. What if we didn't live delayed? What if when God reveals something in our heart and calls us to do something, we stepped in with obedience? We stepped into action. This is what I want us to learn tonight. Don't wait. Obey God immediately. When God calls us and God puts something in our heart, be intentional to do what he calls us to. Be intentional to ask God to reveal areas of my life where I need to be obedient. That's maybe your next step today, is to ask God, where do I need to be more obedient at? Where am I lacking? And whatever he's leading you to or towards, step towards it. No matter how large or how small, obey immediately. Pray and ask God for the opportunity to do what he is asking you to do without objection. So God, reveal to me where I'm disobedient. And as he begins to reveal to us, may we step into what God is calling us to. So what is that for you? What does that look like in your life? Where do you need to be more obedient to what God is calling you to? Let's pray. God, we love you, and we thank you for who you are. Thank you for first loving us. God, we want to be people who take small steps of obedience every day, no matter how small or how big. And so, Lord, help us. God, use our obedience to you for your glory, and so that lives are changed all around the world for your gospel's sake. We love you. We thank you for everything that you guys do. God, everything that you do in our life. In your holy and powerful name. Amen. Love you guys. Once again, thank you for joining us. If this is your first time or we haven't got a chance to meet or connect, we would love to. So go ahead and DM us. And if you have any questions about what obedience could look like in your life or how we can help you take that next step in your faith journey, we would love to do that. We can't wait to see you guys again next week. Have a great week. Peace.